Welcome to night 2 of Wonders of the Salish Sea 2022 and our second presenter. So please join me in welcoming Dave Scott. Dave is a PhD candidate in the Pacific Salmon Ecology and Conservation Lab at UBC with a focus on out-migrating juvenile Chinook salmon in the Fraser Estuary. Previously, Dave worked with Raincoast Conservation Foundation as the Lower Fraser Salmon Program Coordinator. So after Dave's presentation, there will be time for a few questions. Please enter those in the chat and our hosts will moderate those for you. All right, over to you, Dave.
Just before I get started, I'll just say I'm here today and all of this work is done on the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And yeah, very happy to be able to live and work on their territory. So yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today about some work that I do kind of jointly as a biologist with the Raincoast Conservation Foundation, as well as part of my PhD, which I'm currently doing at UBC in the Pacific Salmon Ecology and Conservation Lab with Dr. Scott Hinch. And so, just before I get started, I'll thank a lot of different folks that have supplied funding for the work that we've been doing over the past about 6 years now. So yeah, thanks to all of our funders and all of our assistants and everyone that's worked on this project. Today I'll be talking more about salmon in the Fraser River. So as many people tonight are probably familiar with, the Fraser River is commonly considered one of the greatest salmon producing rivers worldwide. It has a huge diversity of populations of salmon, including some really important large sockeye populations that get a lot of attention, as well as some large populations of Chinook salmon, which are really important prey for other important species like our southern resident killer whales. And then we also have large populations of chum and pink salmon, as well as some populations of coho salmon as well. And kind of as things go, a lot of these populations of salmon are currently of significant conservation concern, especially some of the Chinook and sockeye populations in particular. And yeah, just to bring it back to kind of the Salish Sea. So of course the Fraser River is this massive watershed that takes up a quarter of British Columbia, and it's really a huge driver of the dynamics in the Salish Sea. You can see that the Salish Sea is essentially a big part of the estuary of the Fraser River. We have this huge amount of fresh water and fine sediment that come down the Fraser River and then go out into the Salish Sea, and that's a really important area for those salmon that are coming down the Fraser River as well. So yeah, so this is kind of the general area I'm going to be talking to you tonight about here, the southern Salish Sea, the area around the Fraser Estuary. So sticking with the same area. When we talk about salmon and connectivity, it's something that comes up a lot is the issue of salmon and large dams. But connectivity issues can affect salmon across their life cycles. So I just have kind of the typical salmon life cycle here. We know they have adults that come back to freshwater to spawn, to deposit their eggs. Those eggs incubate in the gravel, and then those really small fish emerge from the gravel, and then as juveniles they have to make their way down to the estuary and then out to the marine environment. So they rely on being able to get in between all of those different habitats to get out to the ocean. They then spend 1 to 5 years in the ocean and then come back as adults. And again, they need to be able to navigate areas to be able to find those important habitats. So they travel those really long distances. We often hear about salmon being extirpated from areas because of dams blocking their upward migration. But there's also a lot of other structures which alter connectivity for salmon. Some of the more common is you'll see road culverts. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit more about structures that we have in the estuary, like jetties and causeways. And when we talk about estuary habitats, so estuaries are those transition areas where the river meets the ocean. And we know that juvenile salmon have to use those areas. So we have all of these diversity of salmon populations that spawn and rear throughout the Fraser River, but they all have to come and move through the estuary on their way out to the ocean. So we know that they rely on them as these migratory corridors. And then we think, when they're making that transition, when a small juvenile salmon is going from a freshwater environment to the ocean, which is a very salty environment, they have to undergo a fairly difficult physiological transition to be able to deal with now having being surrounded by much more salt than they want to have in their body, which is the opposite in freshwater. So, we think they rely on that mixed water in the estuary in order to make that transition. And then we see, them often being referred to as these nursery habitats. So we have these eelgrass meadows. We see these really cool images of juvenile salmon rearing in those areas. So we think they're pretty important also for that nursery area on their way to the ocean. But then unfortunately, estuaries are really good places for humans to live as well. They're very productive. They have a lot of resources. So typically it's not uncommon to see estuaries as places where we have a lot of human activity and a lot of human impacts on the ecosystems. So just to quickly go through our salmon populations in the Fraser River and Salish Sea, we have the 5 species of salmon here: sockeye, chinook, coho, chum, and pink. And they vary pretty considerably in their early life history strategy and thus how they're using the estuary and how much they're relying on the estuary. So when we talk about sockeye salmon, you'll often hear that sockeye salmon are associated with a nursery lake. So a juvenile sockeye will spend at least a year typically rearing in a lake before moving down to the ocean in their second year of life. And thus they're typically not super reliant on estuaries because they've already done that initial year of rearing up in that nursery lake. When we talk about coho also typically spend a whole year in fresh water, but they typically spend it in a small stream or wetland as opposed to a larger nursery lake like sockeye. But in kind of the same way, they'll go out to the ocean in their second or third year of life, and they also, although some life histories tend to use estuaries a little more, typically they're not using them a whole lot, especially in the Fraser. When we talk about pink salmon have this really interesting fixed 2-year life cycle in the Fraser River, where we have these huge numbers of pink that come in and spawn every second year. And then the following year, we see those fish, they move very quickly out to the ocean as juveniles. But you do see them in large numbers in estuaries, but just for a very brief period, and they go very quickly to the ocean. And then when we talk about chum salmon, chum typically aren't the best swimmers. They're not going super far up in the watershed to spawn. And they typically will also go out to the ocean in their first year of life, and they will rear in estuaries for at least sometimes up to a few weeks to get a little bit bigger before going out to the ocean. Lastly, Chinook salmon are thought to be the most estuary reliant, and in particular, there's one life history that's called a ocean type Chinook salmon that goes out to the ocean in its first year of life, and those are the ones that are really the most estuary reliant. Whereas we also have a large number of populations of stream type Chinook salmon in the Fraser, which will spend a whole year in fresh water before moving out to sea. But we have 2 large populations of ocean type Chinook. So the 3 is the Harrison River there, and the 13 is the South Thompson. And those 2 are the only ocean type populations, so the ones that move to the estuary very quickly. And they actually make up the vast majority of returns and pretty much all of the harvest that's been happening for Fraser Chinook over the past several years. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, a lot of these Fraser River salmon populations, including Chinook in the Strait of Georgia and the Salish Sea, really haven't been doing so well over the past few decades. So we've seen pretty significant conservation concern for these. And when we look at the Harrison River Chinook salmon, which used to be the most productive Chinook salmon population in Canada, we see that it's been doing very poorly as of late, unfortunately. And when we look kind of across those Fraser River Chinook populations, again, we see, they really haven't been doing very well, which have led to a lot of headlines like this and a lot of investment by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And so when we look at the lower Fraser, it's really important for a whole diversity of fish species. It supports that Harrison River Chinook salmon population. A lot of the chum and pink from the Fraser River spawn in the lower Fraser, and it's important for some significant sockeye stocks as well. But when we look at that area, I mean, it's pretty obvious from the satellite image that I also previously showed, but obviously there's just been huge transformation of the area from, something that 200 years ago would have been just this amazing production machine, essentially for salmon, rivers, wetlands, sloughs, side channels. It would have been a really, really productive area for salmon, but to fast forward to today, and the vast majority of that habitat has now been lost or significantly altered, and we see what used to be mostly wetlands and forests is now been largely converted for urbanization and agriculture. So this huge transformation of those habitats that those Chinook salmon and others used to rely on. And then when we move out to the estuary, there's a whole nother issue that comes into play, and that's really these structures that have been built across the estuary that have really disconnected different habitats throughout the area. So Ron, was speaking a bit about Roberts Bank and the Roberts Bank Causeway in the southern part of the estuary, but that's only one of several structures in the estuary. We also have the Steveston Jetty, which is kind of in the middle, and then to the north, if you've ever been out to Iona Beach Regional Park and walked out on the Iona Jetty, there's that significant structure, as well as the North Arm Jetty. So in the estuary, these habitats are really disconnected by these various structures. And when you look at what the estuary would have been like historically, you can start to understand why these structures were built in the first place. And so this is a really old map of the Fraser before any structures were built. And you can't read the numbers there kind of at the mouth of the river in Steveston, but essentially these are really low numbers. It would have been quite shallow at the mouth of the river, because as the river meets the ocean, the river slows down and it drops out that sediment that it's carried down with it. So, naturally, you would have actually had this very shallow area at the mouth of the river, what's known as a sill, and it really wouldn't have been very convenient for navigation. And in fact, it was very difficult for boats initially to get into the river. And so when we look at the main arm of the river, so this is say 1827, fast forward to 1860, you can see that the little mouth of the river channel there, it would be meandering over time. Things would change from year to year. But of course, that's not very convenient. So back in 1890, you can see now there's a few straight lines here. And essentially, they started to build structures at the mouth of the river to try to train the river. That's what they're called, river training structures, to essentially hold the mouth of the river into one place and allow for dredging and allow for navigation. And so fast forward to only 1919, and you can see this Steveston Jetty structure has been constructed, and you're going to see it looks like it would be easier to boat into the channel than it used to be. So over time, these structures were added onto and continue to be built, and that kind of gets us to where we are today, where we have this 8-kilometer long Steveston Jetty. We have about a 6-kilometer long jetty on the north arm, the McDonald Slough Causeway, and then down to the south we've got the Deltaport Causeway and the BC Ferries Causeway. And so I'm not the only one who noticed that this might be an issue. And what it really does is it really cuts off those sand and mudflat areas, so those brackish areas of the estuary, and really just kind of forces fish and fresh water and fine sediment and nutrients just kind of out to the end of the river, and instead of kind of allowing them to spill over naturally and build that resilient delta and allow fish and other animals access to those brackish sand and mudflat habitats. So yeah, as I said, we weren't the only ones who thought that this might be a problem. So Fisheries and Oceans Canada started to, look at various structures in various estuaries across southern British Columbia, and back in 2016 announced this Coastal Restoration Fund. And so Raincoast was fortunate to be able to get some funding from the Coastal Restoration Fund to start to look at how we could start to restore connectivity in the Fraser Estuary. And we started with the main structure, the Steveston Jetty. And so this is what it looks like if you're kind of standing on the jetty. You can see there's a river on one side, there's a rock wall in the middle, and there's a marsh on the right-hand side, and then out to the sand and mud flats. And so we decided to make 3 openings in the Steveston Jetty that were 50 meters wide to try to restore that connectivity for juvenile salmon. And so we were very fortunate. We got funding from Fisheries and Oceans Canada to go out and do this restoration work, as well as to do monitoring and research work in the same area. And so I'm going to be telling you a little bit about some of our general kind of juvenile salmon research results, as well as some of the outcomes that we've seen from our restoration work here. And so, yeah, we went out there with Vancouver Pile and Dredge with, pretty heavy duty operation. We created these 3 50-meter wide openings, and then we're just letting the flow of water create channels onto the sturgeon bank side to facilitate fish passage. And so we basically now have done 4 years of construction, which is brought all 3 of our breaches down to basically mean low water. So they're essentially connected at all tidal levels now, and fish are able to move freely from the main river out onto Sturgeon Bank. And so, yeah, I'm just going to now get into a little bit more of our research that we've been doing in the area. So when we started back in 2016, we took a really basic approach where we said, we just wanted to understand where and when juvenile salmon are using the Fraser Estuary. And so the first question is just, what is the timing of migration of juvenile salmon into the estuary? But then we were also really interested in those Chinook salmon that were using the estuary as well, because we know they're the most estuary reliant. And there's these really important concerns for some of those Chinook populations, especially as it relates to their availability as food for killer whales. So when we capture a Chinook, we actually take a little genetic sample so we can figure out which river it came from, which is not something we do with the other ones. And then we wanted to start looking at how they're using different areas across the estuary, across time and space. And then we wanted to know, now that we made these breaches, how do juvenile salmon respond to those breaches? So were they using them, and which species were using them, and at what rates? And so we have sites located in habitats across the Fraser Estuary. So we have sites down to the south in the eelgrass at Roberts Bank. We have sites that are located across the sand and mud flats, and then we have sites in the marsh as well. And so we use a variety of techniques to capture fish at these sites. We go out there each year, basically from mid-March through to mid-August. So we're already well into the swing of things. It's been very windy lately, which has been frustrating with the big storms. But yeah, we're out there right now. We used beach seine like this. We also use a perch seine, a small modified perch seine as well, out in the eelgrass and sand flat areas. And what we found originally is that these habitats vary really considerably. So we have those inner estuary marshes, which are the kind of the light blue squares. So this is just showing the salinity of those areas. If you look at the eelgrass up at the top, those are the green circles. And what we see is basically the effect of the causeway at Roberts Bank. So the eelgrass areas down there are very salty. The water is very clear because of the causeway. And then in the middle is those brackish areas that fish really don't have access to right now because of all the different structures. And so we found that the highest diversity of fish is in the eelgrass area. So we found almost 40 different species throughout our sampling in the eelgrass, and we found around 20 different species in the sand flat and marsh areas. But when we looked at where we were capturing our salmon, so it's Chinook along the top and then chum along the bottom, we found that with the vast majority of our sampling, we do capture those juvenile salmon in those inner estuary marshes, and we're not seeing so many of them out on those sand and mud flats, where the connectivity is altered by the jetties, and we don't see them so much down in the eelgrass at Roberts Bank as well. although we do have some sampling days where we do catch decent numbers. And so now just to kind of give you guys an idea of how the different species use the estuary over time, I'm going to just show you a figure that has the fork lengths. So basically the lengths of the fish on the Y, and then on the x-axis is just the days of year, and I'll just show you some different species. So when we go into the estuary really early in the season, we catch a lot of really small juvenile pink and chum. So that's what we're capturing right now. Mostly is these really small, like about 4 centimeter long juvenile chum and pink. And you can see that they're mostly captured in kind of April and early May, and then they really drop off after that. We also have this kind of unique population of sockeye fry that we see coming through at fairly small sizes. So this is in the kind of 5 to 8 centimeter range here. And those are coming through in kind of June and July. But when we look at the Chinook that we're really interested, we have these kind of 2 main groups. So we have these really large stream type Chinook, which are coming out in their 2nd year of life. And they're about 10 centimeters, kind of between 8 and 12 or 13 centimeters. So a pretty decent size. But then we also have these really small ocean type Chinook that are from the Harrison River and the South Thompson River that we catch in the estuary kind of right at the end of March, early April, and we see them there all the way through until August. So we see them spending time in those estuary habitats and really feeding and growing a lot. And my colleague Leah Chalafor, she recently looked at some otoliths from Harrison River Chinook. And what we found is that those Harrison River Chinook, they're really the dominant fish in the estuary. So as I mentioned, from March kind of all the way through into June, they tend to leave. And then we see those South Thompson fish coming through and using the estuary in kind of July and August. So we have one kind of group of juvenile Chinook that's using the estuary really extensively from April, May, and then into June. They leave, but then they're replaced by another group of South Thompson Chinook, which are the one population of Chinook salmon in the Fraser River who are actually doing quite well right now. So they're at some of their highest levels ever. So they have also kind of a unique life history there. And when we look just at the Harrison Chinook, you can see that they're really staying in the estuary and really growing over time. My colleague Leah Chalafor, she looked at otoliths from these little Harrison Chinook salmon. And otoliths are little ear stones that form these really handy rings, essentially like tree rings. And what she found by looking at the otoliths from fish that we captured in the estuary was that these Harrison Chinook were spending an average of 6 weeks in the estuary and growing at a rate of about 0.5 millimeter per day, which is pretty good. And so just to kind of sum up our juvenile salmon research, so we found that juvenile salmon, they really highly rely on the Fraser estuary, including those marsh habitats. So we're seeing juvenile salmon from late March all the way through into mid-August, including a high number of Chinook, chum, and pink. And we found that Chinook salmon are present in the estuary for the longest period, and they really rely on those areas for growing and rearing before moving further out to the ocean. When we look at juvenile Chinook from the Harrison River in particular, we see that they arrive in the estuary the earliest, really small, and they stay for 6 weeks. So they're really reliant on these areas. And so now back to our breaching project. So this is what the Steveston Jetty looked like kind of before we did any construction. So now this is what it looked like after the first year of construction. So you can see we made these 3 basically rectangular openings, and then we're just allowing the flow of water to create channels behind them over time. And so this is what it looks like a little more recently. So you can see at the west breach, we've had this huge amount of channel formation, and then some channel formation happening at the other sites as well. And so after doing this work, we've been out there monitoring fish moving through the area. In 2019, you can see, we were just kind of standing just back from the construction area. There were only really small channels for fish to move through. And then moving into 2020 at our east breach here and the west breach on the right, you can see we've had all this channel formation that's happened from the flow of the river over time. That's really expanded, the channel here. and has really expanded fish passage. And our middle breach, not so much channel formation. You can see it's still moving along pretty slowly there. And so when we went out and looked at fish moving through the breaches, in the first year, we captured over 550 juvenile salmon moving through our breaches with not a whole lot of sampling effort. So we were out there for a few hours once every 2 weeks. And yeah, we captured a decent amount. But then the second year, once there had been some more channel formation, we did quite well where we were capturing pretty good numbers of Chinook, some interesting bursts of sockeye and pink, as well as a large number of chum salmon moving through as well. And just to kind of show you some figures on how many fish we're capturing per hour. So this is the number of Chinook per hour. The dark gray circles are 2020. And the open circles are 2019. So you can see in 2020, we had a bunch of sampling days where we're capturing in the range of 30 to 50 juvenile Chinook per hour moving through at an individual breach location. So we were really happy to see that, and even to see that, going into June and July, we're still capturing low numbers of fish utilizing our breaches. So yeah, we were really happy to see that we built it and they're actually using it. And when we look at chum, we've seen some really high rates, over 200 chum per hour moving through our breach. You can see it matches up well with kind of what we see for their typical ecology, that it's mostly April that they're in that area using the breaches. And then when we looked at the other species, we had some days where we had some really high numbers of pink salmon and sockeye salmon captured at our breach locations, although that was in kind of over a much smaller time frame. So. But when we kind of go back to our Chinook that we're most interested in, you can see that we're capturing a large number of these really small Chinooks. So this is the fork lengths again on the y-axis here. So these 4 to 5 centimeter long Chinook that we're pretty confident that these Chinook don't want to leave the marsh yet, that they're not quite ready to head out to that saline water. So we're pretty confident that the breaches are allowing these fish to remain in the estuary like we were hoping. And then we're also seeing some of these bigger stream type Chinook as well. And yeah, we're also really happy to see these fish still moving through kind of out into July and August more recently. And so just to summarize, so right after we made the breaches in 2019, we saw low numbers of really small chum and ocean type Chinook. But in 2020, we saw some really good rates of passage with all 5 species of salmon, some of these larger stream type Chinook, and had some cool days where we caught large numbers of pink and sockeye moving through as well. And back to our kind of main focus, which is those ocean type Chinook. We're seeing them from March through August at our breach location, so we're really happy about that, and seeing some really high rates of fish passage per hour with over 50 Chinook per hour captured at peak times. And so just to let you know kind of what else is happening with the project. So channel development is going to continue to occur for the next many years. It's going to be interesting to see how things end up out there. But eventually, we're hoping that it's going to form some nice channels. And then we're still out there doing monitoring. So I was supposed to be out there today, but it was too windy. So maybe tomorrow will be better. But yeah, we've already captured some juvenile salmon out at our breach locations this year. And we're also working on more projects. So we actually have also done a new project to put a breach into the North Arm Jetty. So this is the North Arm Jetty here. It basically goes from the Iona sewage treatment facility out just kind of past UBC out to the ocean there. And so that's a 6 kilometer long structure. And we have just recently, back in February, we created a 30-meter wide breach at this middle breach location here. And so we're going to be out, we're also out there monitoring that breach as well. And we're going to be hoping to make 2 more breaches out in that North Arm Jetty over the next few years. And yeah, so first breach was just recently completed. And so I figured, it's kind of in the interest of bringing it back to what Ron was talking about earlier tonight, that I would also kind of mention the potential implications for Roberts Bank Terminal 2 for juvenile salmon. And so you can see, that we're out there working hard to try to restore connectivity for juvenile salmon in the Fraser River Estuary. So we've created these breaches in the Steveston Jetty. We're also starting to create breaches in the North Arm Jetty. Metro Vancouver is looking at the McDonald Slough Causeway. Our partners at Ducks Unlimited actually recently created a few small openings in this, which is known as the Woodward Jetty. But of course, the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project really represents a step in the opposite direction. So another impact that would further really reduce connectivity for juvenile salmon in the Fraser Estuary. So I was an expert evidence provider on behalf of Raincoast for the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project. And so, my submissions really focused around that potential loss of connectivity and, how that further affects juvenile Chinook salmon in the Roberts Bank area. And so, as Ron mentioned, the Roberts Bank area is home to this extremely productive eelgrass ecosystem that is actually, kind of somewhat artificial because, it's really sustained by that causeway blocking those fine sediments and blocking that fresh water. So creating a really perfect area for eelgrass, which is high salinity and nice clear water. So, it's this extremely productive ecosystem, but can salmon get there? And so what we found, that we catch the highest densities of fish in the eelgrass, but as I mentioned before, we're not really seeing a lot of juvenile salmon out there. So, maybe they're just dispersing already, or perhaps that has to do with the causeway. But yeah, not seeing a lot of juvenile salmon out in those areas. So, when we're looking at ways that we can improve connectivity for juvenile salmon across the estuary, the idea of adding this whole other structure, which then forces juvenile salmon to go much further out into that deep saline water if they want to then stay in those kind of estuary habitats. So I think Ron kind of alluded to, they've also suggested putting some openings through the causeway here as part of the mitigation for Terminal 2, but what they're proposing are 10-meter culverts, and you can see from the scale of the work that we're doing that it's really larger breaches on the order of 30 meters is kind of what we would recommend to really restore connectivity. But that would come with a whole nother bag of issues. As I just said, the eelgrass really benefits of fresh water. So, it's tough to mitigate all those impacts. But I thought I would just kind of throw that in from the salmon angle. It's a little more straightforward than the biofilm angle. Happy to. I'm going to wrap it up there, and happy to take questions.
Oh, thanks very much for that, Dave. There was a lot to cover in that relatively short period of time that we've given you. So there are a few questions in the chat, and just a reminder to everybody that you just go ahead and type your questions in there, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So the first one, maybe I don't know if you'll be able to answer this one. Are Chinook salmon named after the village of Chinook at the mouth of the Columbia River?
I do not know, but that would be an interesting fact, and that might be the case because Chinook is weird with the salmon in that you capitalize it because it's a proper name, whereas the other salmon you don't capitalize them, but Chinook you always capitalize it. So that might be why. So I'm curious. So if anyone else knows if that's truly the case, I'd be very curious.
We'll see if somebody puts something in the chat.
Another question is, what exactly is fork length?
Yeah, so basically just when you measure the length of a salmon, it's kind of difficult to pinpoint kind of where you want to measure it from, because the tail, unlike some other fish that have kind of a flat back on their tail, a salmon's tail has a fork to it. So essentially it's yeah, it's longer at the tips than it is in the middle. So you just kind of measure to where the tail forks, as opposed to measuring like the total length that you would for other fish species.
So a lot of questions about the, the breaches and so on through the jetties. Felix was wondering, are the channels growing on their own, or are you dredging more every year?
Yeah, so the channels are just growing on their own. So the way that we did the construction was the first year we went in and we cut all 3 down by 1.5 meters to allow the water to start flowing. We then went back and reduced the height of the actual breaches, but that's really just a kind of 20-meter wide section on the jetty. So all that channel formation that's happening behind that on Sturgeon Bank, that's just all with naturally with the flow of water with the freshet each spring.
Thanks. There was one question. Is there research that backs the 30-meter wide breach width?
No, like we're working on that right now, essentially. So we our breaches of the Steveston jetty are 50 meters wide. We still continue to see fish using all 3 breaches, so it's not like there's no fish at the middle breach because they all already went through the east breach. So we're quite confident that basically just providing as large of openings and as many of them is going to allow fish the best chance to end up finding those breaches. So yeah, it's no, I haven't found a paper that has really optimized the breach size too much, but we're doing our follow-up monitoring to try to get an idea for sure of how big is necessary.
So exact science, right, on those things. Someone did respond about the Chinook, saying, according to Wikipedia, hang on, I have to back up here, its common name is derived from the Chinookan peoples. Chinookan. So that would be, again, I guess, why it would be capitalized. So hang on, I'm losing my questions here. So yeah, somebody else was asking, Caitlin was asking, how far apart are the breaches from one another? So not the width of them, but between each breach.
Yeah, I mean, they're between like 500 meters and 1 kilometer away from each other. So we're trying to spread them out a little bit and essentially trying to find spots that we're already kind of like on a little bend in the river or something like that to further facilitate flow going through the breaches. But yeah, they're probably about 500 meters away from each other. I should know, I walk between them all the time, but yeah, we tried to space them out to just kind of create the best chance of fish finding them.
Some interesting interest in the breaches. Would it be possible to construct breaches for the causeways? I'm assuming that's the ferry and the Colton.
Yeah, so like the thing with the breaches that we're doing right now that makes it a little bit easier is that these are just jetties that aren't driven on or anything like that. So we've just made these openings, and it's not like we've put in a bridge or anything to that effect. But when you introduce the fact that the causeways are roads that would require bridges or culverts, which is what's being proposed, it's a lot different because they have to bear all that weight, and they also have to live up to seismic standards. And you can imagine out in the estuary, these structures are essentially built out of rocks and sand, and so putting in a bridge that now meets seismic standards becomes much more difficult. So the openings would they're just kind of constrained by the fact that you really have a lot of weight, and the causeways are quite wide as well. So I believe the Roberts Bank Causeway is around 200 meters wide. So that's also pretty far for if you're putting in a culvert for fish passage. How many of them are really going to swim through this really long culvert? Which is also nice about the jetties is the North Arm jetty at the top of it is maybe 50 meters wide or something to that effect. So and our breaches are all open air, so they're just totally open. But yeah, it becomes a lot more tricky when you want to have you know, a bridge and cars going over it. But it's certainly, you know, an option to investigate for sure.
So I have a question that's on sort of a different thing now. So Sheila was wondering, she says, probably difficult to know and likely varies with species, but has anyone been able to estimate the length of time for the fry to physiologically adapt as smolts from the freshwater to saline water?
Yeah, so yeah, it totally depends on the species. So it seems like and kind of whether they're going out in their first year of life or their second year. It seems like the ones that go out in their second year, they're getting a trigger that's like based on the rhythm of the sun changing. So in the spring, they're saying, okay, the days are getting longer. We need to start getting ready to adapt. And then they start to kind of become ready before they make their way down to the estuary. So they're kind of just being triggered based on the length of day. And they don't spend as much time in the estuary. They're already quite a bit bigger. But some of these, you know, species like chum and chinook that are coming down to the estuary when they're still only, you know, essentially a few weeks old, a few months old. They're kind of on a fixed clock of they're just growing and their body is getting ready to transition. So they're kind of more fixed on how much food they're getting and how quickly they're able to grow. So then they'll kind of make that transition. But it does happen quite quickly for sure. Once they hit a threshold, they start being able to deal with it pretty quickly.
Thanks for that. That's lots more questions coming in. Here's a question from Nancy. Given all the sources of mortality to salmon, what % gain do you estimate from improving estuary habitat?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really like have a specific estimate for that. Like we're just trying to, you know, kind of do what we can to give them the best chance of survival. And it's really tough with a project like this to actually know, you know, like, okay, did a juvenile salmon that swam through the breach survive better than one that didn't find the breach? You know, it's really tough, especially with these little fish, to kind of, you know, track them after or do something else to get an idea of you know, whether or not it's having that desired impact. So you know, we don't have like a specific estimate, but you know, we're really hopeful that by doing everything we can to work on improving connectivity, and we're working on some other projects with some partners like Ducks Unlimited and the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance to do a few other projects in the estuary in the near future. So yeah, we're basically taking the funding, which is quite available right now, and trying to do what we can. So hopefully we'll be able to see an impact. But of course, there's a lot of other stressors, as you mentioned. So dealing with pollution would be a good step as well.
Yeah. So many sources of, like say, mortality and just danger to them in general. So I'm going to put this one out here because I think that it's a question that you might enjoy asking or answering rather. Why are Chinook salmon so important to the southern resident killer whales?
Yeah, it's a great question. So basically, the Chinook salmon are often called, you know, king salmon or spring salmon, and they're called king salmon because they're the largest of the salmon species. So you see these, you know, trophy Chinook salmon. If you've ever seen one of those photos from like the Columbia in 1900, and they're, you know, they've got these giant Chinook that are like 100 pounds or more, and so, you know, you can imagine that if you're a killer whale, you want to go for the biggest salmon species out there that you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, especially when you're using echolocation. You probably rely on actually going after a bigger fish anyway. And then the other name that Chinook often have is spring salmon, and that's because they're often the first salmon to return back to the river each spring. And so in the Fraser River, we have spring salmon, summer salmon, or spring Chinook, summer Chinook, and fall Chinook. And so that would have historically provided, this portfolio of food for those whales. So they would have been able to rely on different populations with different run timings over time. But right now, those spring and summer runs have been really doing poorly. So it's really limiting, their availability. But yeah, that's a couple of the reasons why they're so important.
A couple of another question that from Betty: why consideration is given to earthquake fiat lines, the big one when planning other fish habitat or bridges and causeway? I guess that question is maybe like, you had sort of mentioned earthquake proofing the causeway.
Yeah, well, it's just like we'd really like to open up the McDonald Slough Causeway, but it's really difficult because essentially, it's my understanding, I guess, that say there's a car on the bridge that you made when the earthquake happens, the bridge can't like fall over and throw the car into the ocean. So you would be responsible. So you have to, like, the whole causeway could melt around it, and your bridge needs to still be standing after. I mean, but those are the standards you have to build it to, I guess. So like we hired some engineering firm, and that's what they told us, and we left it as that. So.
Given the nature of the whole estuary zone there, I sort of have my doubts that the bridge would stay standing anyways. But anyway, so maybe we have time for one more here. Sheila was asking, do you think that removing dams is one solution to increasing the populations of native salmon species?
Sure, and also I saw Marie has a question there. I think it's definitely worth exploring the causeway breaches. It's just challenging to make them large enough, but I definitely think it's worth exploring. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really fortunate in the Fraser River compared to the Columbia is that we really don't have a lot of dams. So, the Columbia, I think, has 13 main stem dams or something, and the Fraser has 0 main stem dams. So that part is really good, but we do have some tributaries such as the Alouette and the Coquitlam, which don't even have a fish ladder. So, I think simple things like putting a fish ladder on the Alouette Dam is probably a good start. But yeah, we're lucky that it's not more of a problem in the Fraser, but definitely, could be improved, the situation at some of the structures that we do have.
I think we're pretty much running out of time here, but thank you so much, Dave, for answering everybody's questions and for a really thorough and interesting presentation. And someone did comment that they liked your hair, so
thanks.
I know that's sort of an aside from everything, but yeah, thank you so much for that.
No problem.
All right, over to you, Liz.
Yeah, thanks. So that's it for this evening's program. And the link and recording will be available later this week. Please check the Transition Salt Spring website YouTube channel, and see you in 2 weeks. So a reminder that there's no class next Monday, but on April 25th, we have the Sounders, the Gray Whales of the Salish Sea with John Callum Bocadis, and The Curious World of Seaweed with Josie Islin. So see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.